All right, now we're ready. Hope you enjoyed your day off yesterday and election day, and hope you got to see some of the things that we've been learning about in action with the election of the President of the United States. Today's lesson, we're going to continue on our learning about the first President of the United States, George Washington. So let's take a look at a text today called President Washington. I'm going to read this text with you, and then I'm going to have some questions for you to answer. If you would like to read it yourself, you don't have to watch me read the video, watch me read the lesson to you. You can just skip this video and go read the next few pages yourself, but you might as well listen to me read it. It'll help you. I'm going to describe some of the things in more detail. So let's take a look at this first page here, and make sure you listen and read it completely. Use the text to answer the question so you can make a good grade. Go back and find the evidence in the text to support the answer you choose, okay? So here we go. President Washington. The Constitutional Convention ended in September. Remember, that's the meeting they had to write the Constitution. However, this didn't mean the Constitution automatically went into effect. For the Constitution to become the law of the land, it said that 9 of the 13 states had to ratify or approve it. This was not a simple task. After all, many Americans didn't want a constitution that gave the national government new powers. The two sides of the Constitution debate became known as the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists. Two of the best-known Anti-Federalists were Patrick Henry and Samuel Adams. They believed the new Constitution would create a government that was too powerful, maybe just as bad as the British government it replaced. We also read yesterday that Thomas Jefferson was an Anti-Federalist. Important Federalists include James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. Their cause was aided by George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, who both favored the new Constitution. One of the reasons Washington defended the Constitution is that the document created an orderly system under which it could be changed over time. Delaware was the first state to ratify the new Constitution in December of 1787. Other states followed, and in June of 1788, New Hampshire became the 9th state to do so. However, one of the things that came out of the debate about the Constitution was a concern that the rights of individuals needed to be better addressed. Therefore, it was decided that as soon as the government was in place, a Bill of Rights would be added to it. President, and precedent. Two words that kind of sound alike, don't they? We'll talk about what precedent means in a minute. With the Constitution approved, there was no doubt as to who would be the first president. Under the electoral system spelled out in the Constitution, Washington was elected unanimously on April 6, 1789, and took office later that month. Washington was nervous about this at the time. In fact, he wrote to a friend that I greatly apprehend that my countrymen will expect too much from me. Because of this, President Washington was very thoughtful and careful. Washington would remain president for 8 years, and during that time, many important things took place, including the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution were added, known collectively as the Bill of Rights. These amendments were added because of the concerns that the original Constitution didn't do enough to protect individual rights. So we've learned about the Bill of Rights, those first 10 amendments. 3 new states became part of the United States when George Washington was president: Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Our state became a state while George Washington was president. The president divided the responsibility of his branch of government into 4 parts: foreign policy, treasury, the military, and law. He put Thomas Jefferson, in charge of foreign policy, a position known as Secretary of State. He appointed Alexander Hamilton in charge of the Treasury, a position known as Secretary of the Treasury. He put Henry Knox in charge of the military, a position known as the Secretary of War. Finally, he appointed Edmund Randolph to be the Attorney General to make sure federal laws were carried out. Together, these 4 men became known as the Cabinet. So these are the same 4 men we read about in our social studies book on Monday, the 4 men that George Washington picked to help him run the country. President Washington made it clear that he was against the idea of political parties. However, during his 8 years as president, 2 parties emerged. Since the country's first huge debate had to do with the Constitution, America's first two political parties were known as the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. The Federalists believe in a strong central government. The Anti-Federalists were in favor of giving more power to the states and less to the federal government. So let me go back one slide, if I can. Whoops. There we go. So we didn't read this. So here's his second inauguration in Philadelphia, Washington's second inauguration. When he put his hand on the Bible and promised to defend the Constitution. But I wanted you to read this. Alexander Hamilton, who was the first Secretary of the Treasury, is now on a $10 bill. So if you have a $10 bill, you'll see Alexander Hamilton's picture on it. He was the Secretary of the Treasury. Start right here in this paragraph. Almost everything President Washington did set a precedent, which means it started a trend that remained for a long time. As president, Washington made it clear that he wanted the U.S. to remain out of foreign wars. This wasn't easy in 1793 when France declared war on Britain during the French Revolution. Instead of being called Your Highness like a king, Mr. Washington insisted on being called Mr. President, which continues today. So if you watch President Trump being interviewed, they'll say Mr. President. They'll ask him a question that way. After 2 terms and 8 years as president, Washington chose not to run for re-election, setting a precedent that would remain for 150 years. In 1797, John Adams, which was George Washington's vice president, John Adams was elected the second president of the United States. When he was sworn in on March 4th, 1797, it was a very important day for the United States, the first peaceful transition from one president to another. Washington retired to his home at Mount Vernon, Virginia, where he died 2 years later. You got to visit that place on Monday, didn't you? Visit Mount Vernon, the virtual website. During the latter part of his life, he was already becoming known as the father of our country, and he has been commonly known as that since. So, George Washington, very, very important man in the history of our country. He fought in the French and Indian War. He was the leader, the general in the Revolutionary War. He was our first president. He set all those precedents about how a president should act when his term was over. He wasn't like a king. He wasn't bringing the army to keep himself king. He stepped down and went back to his farm and let somebody else be president. Sometimes that happens. And it's what we want to happen as a peaceful transition when it's time for a new president. So while I'm recording this, I don't know who won the election because I'm recording this before the election. So I don't know if we have a peaceful transition to a new president or if President Trump is staying president yet, because I'm recording this before the election. So, but I'll know on this day next week, and you will too. Okay. So interesting text about George Washington. You'll have 10 questions you'll need to answer on this text. And I would do that first. After you get those 10 questions answered while it's fresh on your mind, then you can go to this last slide. Remember on Monday, we took a virtual tour of Mount Vernon, George Washington's house. Well, this link right here, if you'll click on this, when you get to the last slide, it will take you to a virtual tour of the White House. Here it is. And so it's kind of like the one that we looked at the other day. You can click on little buttons and it'll click on different places, and you actually get to go inside the White House and see what the inside of the White House looks like. So answer your questions first, then you can come back and spend some time this afternoon looking inside the White House to see where the president lives and what it looks like. All right, enjoy it. Do well on those questions. Remember, find your evidence in the text. Make sure you don't just guess. Find your evidence in the text. Do a good job. Talk to you later.